Many will remember 2022 as the year of the war in Ukraine. I will remember this year as the year when the global wars of independence began. The West did not expect this to happen when Russia entered Ukraine in February 2022. The West expected sanctions to turn the ruble into rubble. Instead, failures of diplomacy and leadership have led to escalating crises and multi-dimensional wars, military, economic, diplomatic and cultural. And to many people's surprise, the West is not winning. So begins the next decade of the global wars of independence. We need to learn to live differently on this planet, not under the banner of the liberal rules-based order, but as Narendra Modi says with a text from the Upanishads, as if the world is one family. I'm Jeff Richin. If you haven't been here before, this is the Burning Archive channel, a new YouTube channel that's looking at geopolitics, history and culture. Do join me, subscribe, and I hope I can provide some interesting content for you. The global wars of independence. Well, do you feel as if you are living through historic times? Are you afraid for the fate of the world, or excited because the world order is changing? Well, you are, and you have good reason to be. But if you want to live in a peaceful, free, prosperous, fair, culturally rich world, you might have to endure a few years of hardship first. The next few years will teach the world some difficult life lessons. Those lessons will force us in the West, particularly, and I'm talking from Australia, to give up, not without pain and suffering, some precious illusions. Illusions like America is the leader of the free and democratic world. Illusions like America is not an empire. Illusions like, as Joseph Borrell, the foreign minister for the European Union, says, Europe is a garden and the rest of the world is a jungle. Illusions like we are living in our democracy, and illusions like we are not living in times of war. You see, there is a war going on. It is not World War III, but it is a war that involves most of the world. The global wars of independence have begun. The nations of BRICS are declaring their independence from America. And the most painful thing for those of us who live in what is called the West, in the outer reaches of the empire of lies like Australia, is that the global wars of independence are a rebellion, a series of rebellions against us. We will need to learn that we are the privileged minority, that we are the deniers of freedom and security of the greater world. We are not the citizens of the world of our fantasy. We are the oppressors of the real citizens of the world. We are the golden billion. We are the corrupt stewards of the world's landed estates. We are the thieves who steal the foreign reserves of countries we don't like. We are the deluded legislators of an unfair rules-based order. We are the propagandists. We are the drugged, deluded, compliant consumers of the empire of lies. or at least most of us are. There are many in the so-called Western countries, the collective West, with its Atlantic core of North America and Western Europe, who disagree with the policies and the directions of the leadership elite, who dissent to the directions set by their governments, who urge peace, not endless wars. But it is our wealth, our military, our ideologies, our institutions, and our leaders that the other 6 or 7 billion of the world have rebelled against. It is our international order that will not survive these global wars of independence. The global wars today have one central flashpoint, one first battlefield on the western edge of the Eurasian steppe in a country and a failed state known since 1991 as Ukraine. When Vladimir Putin issued his treaty proposal for new post-World War II European security arrangements in December 2021, it was a last final warning to NATO, the military alliance with which America occupies Europe. When he entered Ukraine, he declared the beginning of the global wars of independence. I have covered that war in Ukraine since February 2022, indeed even before then, and I have never stood with Ukraine. I have been appalled by the extraordinary mind swarm, the barrage of metal drones that descended on the people of the West. Like a degenerate aristocracy of the world, we convinced ourselves overnight that we were winning the war and we had right on our side. But we did not. Our governing elites made catastrophic mistakes. They complacently assumed the peasants would never rebel, let alone launch a superior hypersonic missile against their military forces. They assumed they could set prices for resources like oil and gas they could not control. They assumed they could pick and choose which treaties, which UN Security Council resolutions they followed and which ones they did not. But India, China, Russia, Latin America, Africa, many states of Southeast Asia and of Central Asia have had enough of the West. They have decided to find a new way. Saudi Arabia, India, other major trading countries are looking to trade oil and other resources outside the US dollar system. They are following the money all the way to the decline of US leadership. These global wars will be fought in all our homes. They are being fought in all our homes in the extraordinary culture war that began with the Cancel Russia campaign. These wars are not only being fought with guns, missiles, and tanks. They are being fought with the narratives told in the theatre of the state, performed every night on the internet, on the TV channels, in the press rooms of the mainstream media. It has been fought with sanctions in the markets of the world. It has been fought with diplomacy, good and bad, in the secret chambers of the nations of the world. But on each one of these battlefields, the armies of the West are losing ground. The sanctions have not achieved their aim. Russia's economy is resilient, and the world's need for the resources of Russia is leading countries like India, like China, like many African nations, to find their own ways to continue to trade with Russia. It has been fought in the diplomacy of the world, not only in the United Nations, but in the growing number of multilateral institutions in which the countries of the BRICS, an expanding group of Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, possibly Saudi Arabia, possibly Argentina, in which those countries are finding new forms of practical cooperation and economic and diplomatic interaction. It's also been fought militarily, of course, and the news from the battlefields of Ukraine is increasingly dark for both Ukraine and most dark, I guess, for the people and the conscripted soldiers of Ukraine. But increasingly dark for the West. Russia is pressing its advantages in the war. It's hard to predict war, but certainly I expect, with growing devastation of the military and civilian infrastructure of Ukraine, the increasing loss of key defensive positions in Bakhmut, that Ukraine will soon lose the war, and the regime in Ukraine, so dependent on Western money, arms, and media props, that it will soon collapse. But it has become increasingly clear throughout 2022 that the free peoples of the world, those who nestle outside the defensive wall of NATO's rules-based order, are becoming more assertive and building new associations and institutions. And meanwhile, real cultural diversity is breaking the shackles of the West. Across both the inner and outer reaches of the global American empire, its own citizens, and even some of its former low-status governing elites, such as me, are breaking the shackles of their minds. The internet broke the control of the media, but it did not break the desire of power to control the media. But with people like me, with the huge number of independent voices who are able to speak on the media, people who have covered this war with exceptional skill, like the Duran, Alexander Mercouris, and Alex Christoforou, these people are sharing new ideas, new realistic assessments, and more hopeful paths out of the terrible mess that the Western leadership elites have left their countries. And most disgracefully of all, have led the nation of Ukraine to self-destruction. So that's what you will continue to hear on my channel, as well coverage of geopolitics, but also coverage of history and some of the background developments that without which we could not really understand this extraordinary turning point where a world convinced it had become unipolar in the madness of globalization in the 1990s suddenly broke out into a multipolar world in the 2020s.